What Can a Woman Say? Exploring Gender in Poetry. So this workshop, or it was a workshop, it's now a poetry discussion because of the virus. The virus cannot stop poetry, okay? We are gonna be talking about gender in poetry. So I'm gonna read a little bit for you guys. And then also, we're gonna chat about like, what can a woman say? And the title of our event was, What Can a Woman Say? Exploring Gender in Poetry. So, I've been to a lot of women's appreciation events. I like women, I'm a woman. I get invited sometimes to read at events to talk about poetry. And a lot of times when I get there, all people ever want to talk about are eating disorders and domestic violence. And I love food and I'm not a fan of violence. And so this can get really old. It can get to be kind of a drag where you go to a women's event and all they want to talk about is sex trafficking. And it's not to say that that's not an important issue, because it is. But it's really depressing to think that that's all a woman has to say is something about the violence that is committed against her. That's incredibly depressing. And I do think that there's a lot of injustice against women. Absolutely. I think that's very true. But I think also we need to say more in defense of who we are and where we are in the arts. We have to say more, because guess what? If all we have to talk about is violence, all we're going to get back is violence. So this discussion is going to think about some other things that women can talk about. And I'm going to read some work that I have written that I think is what I would read. You know, if I was invited again to another women's appreciation event, I basically just created one so I could read my stuff. But if I was invited again, here's what I would read, and we'll talk about why. So all of these poems are coming out of my brand new book. It's about 4 months old. So I want to post those pictures. You know how new mothers and fathers post those pictures of their baby with the little month-old sticker on? I could post pictures of my book with the little month-old sticker on. I don't think it would get quite the same reception, but we could totally do that. But the first poem I'm going to read is actually the first poem in my recent collection. And if I was asked, you know, what can a woman say? This is what a woman would say. So this one is called I Begin to Understand Jo March. Now, if anybody has seen the recent Little Women movie, I have not yet, I want to. Jo March is a pivotal character in the Little Women book. There was a book before the movie. It's amazing. Go read it. Not just for girls, it's for guys too. And so I was rereading that book recently and came to a part in the book where I realized that Jo March had something to say to me as an adult. This is a book that's generally marketed toward young women, adolescents. And it was incredible to me that I read it again in my 20s and found that, and I'm trying not to get choked up here, Jo March had something to say to me as a 28, 29-year-old. So it's a powerful thing when a work of literature that you've read a million times can affect you again. So this is my response to what I felt and my attempt to kind of thank Louisa May Alcott for what that book did for me. So this one is called I Begin to Understand Jo March. I begin to understand Jo March. I wanted her wildness. Tramp of russet boots, hair bundled, she defied all ornaments. I wanted energy to overturn expectations. Now all my sisters are mothers, and plump little hands tap at my door, make anti-nonsense of my name. I miss the sisterhood gone. I ache in that self-conscious corner of my heart where other joys crowd. Hope, restless and springy underfoot, shoulders old beliefs aside. I recognize the step of a returning friend. I tune my ears to his laugh at the gate and lean against him as we cross the green ground. That's a poem for me that speaks to what it means to realize you want more out of life, but you're not really sure what that is. And I think that if you've read Little Women, you know that Jo March wants more. She is not content with what she's given, and she's struggling against what's expected of her gender. She's struggling against what's expected of her age. And so it's, again, a really, really powerful work of literature. And so I tried to create something in response to that. Before we continue, do we have any discussion questions thus far?
No.
Okay, great.
I'll interject when people ask one.
Yeah, just throw something at me or something. So perfect. So when I've been to women's readings and women have talked about their work, something that seems to come to the forefront is that you always have to speak as a woman. You always have to talk about your gender. You know, what makes a woman a woman? A lot of women who have gone through procedures to remove their biological female organs have often felt like they were not a woman anymore. So a woman who goes through cancer and has to have her breasts removed or her uterus or ovaries, a lot of people say, oh, I don't feel like a woman anymore, or they feel that somehow their femaleness is being taken away. So it really makes us wonder, you know, what makes a woman a woman? Is it how she dresses? Is it what she does? Is it how she responds? And I'm not sure that I really know the answer to that question, but I would hope, and I don't think it's just biology, because I don't see women who have undergone procedures, especially medical treatments, as not women anymore. It would be incredibly sad to me to think that if a woman had to lose her breasts or her ovaries, that suddenly she's not a woman. That's reducing her to her cells, you know, and that we, since we make meaning out of our lives, I think we are more than just our biology. I think a lot of people with disability definitely kind of chime in on that point. So this is a poem that I wrote in response to my great-grandmother. She was a wonderful woman. She died when I was 9 years old, and I think a lot about how you want to get to know people as an adult that are no longer there, that as a child, you knew people in a very different way than you do as an adult. So I often write poems for my grandmother to think about, you know, if she was still here, what would I say to her? What do I appreciate about her? What do I want to talk to her about? I do find that I miss her a lot. And so this is a poem that reminded me of one of those just really, really deep and powerful memories that I have that, you know, when I think of her, this is what I think of. So this one is called Mint. My grandmother's dining room table is covered by rectangular baking sheets, each lined with plaid kitchen towels. Bunches of mint, still damp from washing, afford the house their fragrance. I open the screen door and stand in the narrow hall, shuffling my feet to smooth the upturned carpet. One hand still gripping the ancient latch, I hail the commonplace, dewy and sharp. So when I think about that poem, I think, do we need to know whether the speaker is a woman? And a lot of times when we think about what can a woman say, we can ask, do we have to know the speaker's gender? Is it important? Is it necessary? It's a person appreciating something about a home. I'm not sure that femaleness or being a woman is as important there, or maybe it's displayed in a different way. But I want to get at the idea that as a woman poet, and even as a male poet, your gender is not going to show up in all the obvious ways. That in your work, you're not always speaking from who you are. Like, you're not always speaking from your brown hair, your 5'2", whatever it is. Sometimes you're speaking to a kind of truth that doesn't really have to do with your biology. It has to do with what you remember and what you prioritize. Did we have some new participants join us?
We have some new participants that joined us.
Awesome.
I reminded them, so make sure that your mics are muted if you are new. Reagan asked the question, why do we need to talk about women?
Oh, that's a good question. I would say we need to talk about women because when we look at the work that is generally taught in schools, it's still mostly male. And when we look at what we expect from women writers, it's often very limited. So, again, like I said, when I've been to events for women, we often expect women to get up and have some sort of confessional writing where they're talking about their body, or they're talking about their romantic life, or they're talking about babies, or they're talking about food. There are definitely topics that we don't expect women to talk about. And on the other end of that, there are definitely what a good friend of mine calls the feminist bookstore poets, who get up and scream at you because of all the injustice that has been done to women. This is something that we need a wider range of what a woman can say. We need not only to have women writing about more and different experiences, but to also invite women to then share those experiences. And Reagan, feel free to follow up if that didn't answer your question.
Yeah, she added in more. So Kamara
Good.
asked the question. She said, what do you think makes a woman besides biological features?
That's a tough question. That's a semester's worth of coursework. What makes a woman, which we don't have time to go into here. So, follow up. Okay. We'll do a follow-up session.
Just for you, Kamara.
Just for Kamara. Zoom, see you at 12:30. But also thinking about how your society creates the expectations for gender. So if we go back to Jo March, she was a woman growing up in the 1860s. She was expected to marry and have children. And she, spoiler alert, she does marry and have children. So sorry to ruin it for you. But not until she is ready. She marries much later than her sisters, and she takes a much longer, she has a career first. Again, spoiler alert, sorry to ruin Little Women for you. But I think our society demands things of people in both genders, both male and female, and we won't even have time to get into any other gender territory. But here's also an interesting thing. When we oppress women, we also oppress men. So this is something that we don't often talk about. But if you demand that women are a certain thing, you're also demanding that men are a certain other thing. So when we are not as willing to let women talk about other things rather than, sex and food, I feel like those are the two big topics. We're also demanding that men be a certain way.
So there's some comments.
Oh, good.
Dora mentions that what makes a woman is how she feels spiritually, not physically.
Okay, I love that.
And Dan Simpson actually asked a really good question. He said, once you reveal yourself in a collection to be a woman or blind, how can you stop a reader from assuming that for all poems in the book?
Yes. Oh my gosh. Great question, Dan. This is a huge, huge challenge as a poet. I have a lot of poems in this collection that I am not the speaker. A lot of times something happened to me, but I said, how can I make it more interesting in a poem? So I changed genders, or I changed the perspective of the poem. So not every poem is autobiographical. And sometimes I think the poems are limited when you think, oh, well, did that really happen to you? It doesn't really matter. The universe of the poem is trying to teach you something. And so it's an incredible challenge that you're always kind of confined by who you are on the page, your autobiography. I've often had journalists ask me, well, how can you talk about the visual world? Because, you have limited vision. Well, I do read a lot. And 100 years ago, they were asking that question of Helen Keller. They were asking Helen Keller, how did she write about the visual world when she was deaf and blind? You use it to transform what you've experienced. It's very rare that just your autobiography alone is interesting. It's usually not interesting. And a lot of people create a lot of, especially novels. Novels are very popular for writing from your personal experience. It can be very limiting to only write from your point of view. And it's sometimes very exciting in a poem to try to say, well, what would, how could I make this from a male point of view? Or maybe take away the idea of gender and, is gender necessary in this poem?
Okay, you can keep going.
All right, good. So let's read another one and then we'll take some more questions. So this is actually a poem that I wrote in a tradition of the poet C.D. Wright. She's really cool. I took a class, you've heard of the word forefather, right? Our forefathers founded this country. This class was called Foremothers, which is kind of an awkward word, but kind of the idea that was cool. Looking at the women who were huge anchors in the poetic tradition. And so I wrote this as part of that workshop on Foremothers. And so every week we had a new female poet to try and copy and imitate. And so I wrote this poem as an imitation of C.D. Wright's Lake Echo Deer, which is a really cool poem. In that poem, C.D. Wright asks a bunch of questions, but she doesn't use question marks. And so the poem is kind of like, is this really happening? Is this not happening? What's really going on? And the form of the poem is really cool. You'll have to buy the book to see it. But I'm going to read it for you, and it's a series of questions. And they're the questions that a child is asking about her experience at a piano lesson. So this one is called Practice. Practice. Can the slim music rack support these wide sheets, thrice folded? Does the lamp sitting in the dark piano wink in welcome or glare? Does the short, balding teacher laugh and tap the bench out of kindness? Will the teacher's patience outlast enlarging notes? Small hands, long accustomed to the cool keys, now tentative below shaking eyes. Corner lamp laughing in bright waves. Light spills over a Chopin nocturne repositioned on huge paper, still blurry. So again, we have another poem that talks about an experience, but doesn't necessarily talk about a woman's experience or a man's experience. The teacher in the poem was male, the short, balding teacher, although I guess he could have been female, but he was definitely male. But the speaker's gender isn't revealed. Does it matter? How would the poem be read if the child was male? How would the poem be read if the child was female? And when we look at those questions, and we can kind of start to see how art can teach us about what we're experiencing in the world. So not just that we put our experience into art, but then art changes the way we look at our own experience.
Paula Hilton said, beautiful reading and poem. I don't think gender matters in practice at all.
Yeah, and I don't think it matters in the poem at all. A lot of times we think about gender in relationship to authority as well. So who has the authority? And in this poem, it's teacher and student. And you guys know what it's like to be in a situation with your teacher, whether it's a conference or a class or a test where you don't feel good enough and you're trying your hardest and it's still not working. And you think, oh my God, is my teacher going to run out of patience for me? Do they see how hard I'm trying? Do they think I'm just being lazy? And in that poem, that is a poem from personal experience. I had such a hard time learning piano because I couldn't read the sheet music. I had to make it so big. It was like huge. It was like this. And I still couldn't read it. And so I'd have to hold the music in one hand and play with the other hand. This is why I gave up on piano. I'm not terribly persistent. It's a bad lesson for you. Be persistent. But it was so hard. And so I thought, what if my teacher gets sick of me? And I know that those of you who are students and you're really trying, you might have those dark days where you think, what if my teacher is sick of me? And that's what I wanted to talk about in that poem.
So Reagan asked, why does art influence the children in both good and bad ways?
I think art can show you what you can experience. There's a lot of people who say that when you read, you take on someone else's life. You're taking on that experience, you're living that life. You know, when you read about a Shakespeare character, you're not going to have that experience as a Shakespeare character. You don't live in Shakespeare's time. So you read about it and you make it part of who you are. And that can work in a good way and that can work in a really bad way. There's often books that I've read where I didn't like the characters. And I thought, I don't want to hang out with these people. And I threw the book across the room.
So Miss Paula Hilton, she said, could you address the title of your poetry collection? Neoteny is a fascinating term. How did you choose it for your book's title? Please explain.
Oh dear. This is when I went with a gut reaction and then had to come up with a very cool explanation later. So neoteny was a word that I found in a TED talk about play and the history of play. And the idea that humans are an incredibly neotenous, that's the adjective, neotenous species. So neoteny in animals and humans is the retention of childlike traits into adulthood. So when they found that humans were the most neotenous, what that meant is that we had the longest childhoods and we were more likely to retain that playfulness and imagination into adulthood. And so I saw that word and thought, that is the coolest word ever. I'm going to bookmark it for the future. I mean, this was like 10 years ago. And I thought, and then I thought about the book and I didn't have a title for it. And I worried that neoteny would be too weird and people wouldn't know what it was. And then I thought, I can't think of a better title. And then my publisher didn't hate it. So I kept it. And I asked a lot of people and I got a lot of advice on both sides. Should you get rid of the title? Should you keep it? And the people who said get rid of it said no one will know what it means. And the people who said keep it said then they'll learn what it means.
So there's another question. Reagan said that men can write poems just like women. So why do people associate poetry and poems as a women's thing? Like, why is it women-centered?
That's actually very recent, because poetry, believe it or not, used to be considered the highest level of art in terms of literature. So back in the day, 1700s, 1800s, to be a poet meant that you had to have a classical education. You had to have the ability to allude to all the Greek mythology and understand all the forms. And so that was actually only available to men. It's in recent years that poetry has taken on what they call a confessional type, which means that you only write about your feelings. You know, here's how I feel, which is not what poetry is. And so when we talk about feelings, who do we think of? We think of women. And so these are actually historical changes, not necessarily just what people feel.
Would you say women express their feelings better through poems than men?
No, I would, well, it depends. Again, it comes back to those expectations, right? Who do we expect to write the war poems? Men, right? Who do we expect to write poems about motherhood or family? Women. I don't think that men or women are more qualified. I definitely don't think that. But it kind of depends on what we expect from an artist. How does that color what we're willing to tolerate from them? So if a woman wrote a bunch of combat poems, would she be as well received as if a man wrote those poems? If a man wrote a bunch of lovey-dovey, I love being a father, my kids are so cute poems, would we be like, what's his problem? Or would we be willing to accept that?
Do you believe that female experiences are seen in a negative light? Why are most poems about women usually negative experiences?
Oh, who asked that?
Kamara.
Kamara, awesome. I think there's a long tradition of writing, of male poets writing bad poems about women. Okay, there's a lot about women who are too cold, you know, they don't return their affection, or women who are beautiful but dangerous. This is something, Kamara, if you have not read Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, please go on to Amazon and buy that book right now. It will change your life. I will post a book list later. But she brings up the point that as long as men are the only ones writing about women, we're going to have a problem, right? And it would be, by the way, this goes both ways. So as long as women are the only ones writing about men, we have a problem, because men need to be able to speak from their experience as well. So this is not just like, rah, rah, women are so great, you know. I don't want to read a book that's only women talking about men, or, you know, only men talking about women. I want people to be able to speak authentically from where they are. Reagan, great question. Again, we're going back to history. Okay, so who had the power for the longest? That's why. It's the same way, by the way, this is the same thing that goes on with disability versus non-disability. So I'm a blind woman, all right? I'm not wearing my dark glasses right now, but I normally do wear them. I normally walk with a guide dog. When I walk into a classroom, you guys can hear me getting super irate. When I walk into a classroom, people assume I'm lost. Okay, they have asked me, can I help you find a seat? I dress like a teacher all the time. No student would dress like me. Like I used to wear my hair in a bun. I used to wear all black and like, cuffs and a collar, like super preppy. No college student would dress like that. I have walked into a meeting with the meeting handouts in my hand and sat at the front of the room and had people assume that I'm not the leader, because what they expect to be the leader is not a blind woman, right? A non-disabled person, okay? If I'm waiting for a friend, people assume that I'm lost. Are you lost? I get that a lot. And I appreciate that people want to help me. I think that comes from a good place. But when people have a hard time believing that I'm the teacher, that doesn't feel so good. I was ordering a coffee one time on campus, and the guy fixing my coffee was like, oh, how's your schedule this semester? And I said, oh, it's really good. I have a lot of great students. And he said, what? I said, yeah, I'm a teacher. And he was like, oh, really? You can do that? Do you teach Braille? I was like, no, I don't teach Braille. What do you teach? I said, English. I have 2 degrees in English. So I'm going to calm down because I'm getting irate. But that the same forces that make us see certain groups as better than other groups are reach across gender, disability, race, class, level of education. It is all about the history and how often we have seen these people doing what they're doing. So if I'm the first blind poet you meet, then you're going to be like, oh, I didn't know blind people could do that. Cool. And then you might move on. But if you never meet a blind poet, you may not think blind people can do that. And you certainly wouldn't be in the minority. Same applies to Black, white, Latino, male, female. And that's why when people ask, like, why do we talk about women? Because the representation is still not there. Women are often not seen as serious writers. More questions?
Nope.
Okay, awesome. Well, since we are unlimited in terms of time, let's read one more.
Oh, I got one question.
Sure.
Honest wanted to know, Emily, who are your influences? Do you find yourself reaching more for women poets? And then Kamara has a different question.
Okay, awesome.
But that one is just simply about what is it that influences you in terms of poetry?
I do not tend to like intellectual poetry. So like T.S. Eliot, I don't care for that. I love E.E. Cummings, actually. Yeah. Joel's over here laughing. I love E.E. Cummings. I don't know that I necessarily seek out women poets, like, oh, I can only read women. I don't do that. But I like poets who do a lot of sound work. So like Emily Dickinson, she does a lot with her sounds. I'm reviewing a book right now by Alison Hallett. She's a British poet, and she does a lot of work with her sounds. Lots of rhyme inside the poem, not just at the end. And they're poems that are meant to be read aloud. I tend to enjoy those the most. I do like a lot of male poets. I would say it really determines more on the poet's style. So I like very concrete poems. I like poems that are very focused. They might be trying to do something really small. So I don't need a poem that's like 4 pages long. I like a poem that's maybe 1 page long. In terms of influences, again, Dickinson, I love her. She's amazing. Rainer Maria Rilke is a German poet, and I always read him in translation because I'm not cool enough to know German yet. I, again, tried to study it, and I was like, well, this is hard, give up. So, again, I shouldn't be telling you guys all my secrets, but sometimes things are hard, and you just have to give up. So I like Rilke. I love Seamus Heaney. He won the Nobel Prize for Poetry in the 90s. He's really cool. But again, I don't tend to go to only female poets. I tend to like poets that are doing a lot of really immediate sound work. I don't tend to like the real confessional poetry that's just, this is how I feel, because that's not a feeling is not necessarily a poem. Yes, absolutely. Yes. So if you say that this group of people doesn't have their own thoughts and feelings, then we are not going to take them seriously. And that it's not just about women. We objectify a lot of people in society. So when you objectify someone, you make them an object and you say, what can this object do for me? You don't say, how does this person feel? How do they think? What's important to them? It's only what they can do for you. It's like if you go into your pantry and you see beans and rice on your shelf and you go, oh, I could make a meal with that. When you objectify a person or a group, you put them on your shelf and you only think about interacting with them when they are useful to you. And so that can be incredibly damaging.
There's no more questions. I don't know if
Okay.
another reading.
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, the poem I want is at the very end of my collection, so I have to page all the way through.
So Reagan said, why do women have very strict standards and have to stick to the status quo?
I don't know that women do. I think it would come from how someone is raised, what culture they're growing up in, and again, how much education and influence they have. So Virginia Woolf would tell you that a woman needs money, her own room, and some free time in order to do what she wants.
Yes.
So if women are not able to have what the basics, they're not going to be able to run out and write a bunch of poetry or have a life-changing experience. So again, you need a little bit of money, you need some private space so you can write undisturbed or paint undisturbed or whatever, dance, sing, whatever it is, and you need some free time. And a lot of times in certain cultures, women don't have access to a lot of that. And there are times when men don't have access to that. So again, this is not just like, oh, only women have a hard time. Men have a hard time too. Any follow-up questions? Okay, awesome. So I'm going to read you guys. This is a poem that I wrote because somebody told me, a colleague of mine said, I'm trying to write a blind character, but I don't know what to do with her. Should I make her lose her glasses? And I thought, really? That's the only thing you can think of for a blind person to do. And so in the same way as, you know, sometimes we only think of writing female characters as love interests or as mothers. This is kind of my response to when that happens to people who are disabled. And so this poem is called A Phenomenology of Blindness. And phenomenology is a nice big academic word, but what it means is you're trying to figure out the truth of something with your senses. So if I said a phenomenology of grass, I would say grass looks green, grass smells damp, grass feels squishy, you know, whatever. So you're trying to use your senses. So a phenomenology of blindness is a poem that's trying to tell you what blindness is. And so this is how it goes. A phenomenology of blindness. It's not like walking through life with your glasses off. I mean, sometimes we wear glasses, but they're different from yours. Thicker, broader, darker, and they don't work the quotidian miracle of correctable vision. It's not like getting your eyes dilated once a year, staggering out to the car under those stiff black shades with the sharp edges, tearing up beneath the merciless sun and wondering how you'll manage the drive home. Someone texted you, but you can't read your phone. It's not like groping in the dark when you can't come home late and you can't find your keys because you and your girlfriends had too many pomegranate martinis. I know it was a birthday, but if you could think clearly, you'd know where your keys are. It's not like leaving the nail salon after a pedicure, shuffling forward in disposable flip-flops, doing everything you can not to chip that gorgeous raspberry shimmer polish. It's not like that at all. It's not like feeling faint because you forgot to eat lunch. You were working so hard you couldn't even stop for a granola bar. So you cling to your colleague's arm as he guides you outside. It's nice to have support, you think. Nice to know he doesn't mind helping. It's not convenient, popular, or cumbersome. It's not a filter that you can slide over the world. Not a stylish coat hanging in your closet. I too am waiting for winter because I love wearing my coats. Pea coats, swing coats, blazers. I have so many. It's just that blindness isn't one of them. So when we think about gender or race or ability or disability. This poem is where I've tried to say, you can't just put it on without thinking. You can't just say, you know what my experience is like without trying to get to know me. Oh, well, I put on a blindfold and wander around my house. That doesn't mean that you know what my day-to-day experience is like. A guy who puts on a dress and a wig and walks around doesn't know what a woman's day-to-day experience is like. You have your experience, and you have your experience trying to have my experience, but you don't have my experience. So that's probably my angriest poem.
Paula said she loved the poem and thought it was a great closing line. And Reagan asked the question, why do people seem to think that blind people need glasses or just can't see without the assistance? Hollywood makes that seem true and a stereotype.
Oh yeah, like if they lose their glasses, it's, the worst thing ever. I don't know. And it's kind of weird. I knew a guy in high school, and every time he saw me in the hallway, he would ask me, have you been to the eye doctor lately? And I'm like, is that all you think I do? Like, go to school, go home, go to the eye doctor. That's all blind people do. And I said, no, dude, I go once a year, just like you. Hey, they can't fix my vision. That's why I don't need to go that often. But it was so weird to me that that's the only question he could ever think to ask me. Not like, oh, how's the chorus that you sing in? Or how's the musical? Or, hey, it looks like you're getting an A in math. But yeah, so I don't know why people fixate on that. Just like, if someone's in a wheelchair, people fixate on, oh, what would happen if they fell out of it? Like, that's crazy. Like, non-disabled characters, we don't fixate on like, what would happen if they fell out of a chair, or what would happen if they left their glasses off. It's like they can't imagine you having another experience, which is why we come back to the idea of art and representation. If I show you through my poetry that I can have lots of experiences, it may not be so hard for you to believe.
So do you think
that she really likes this poem because it can be adapted to all types of people?
Mm-hmm.
So Kamara, do you mean, I'm just going to jump, do you think that this is because it can apply to all people, race, religion, sexual orientation, whatever? Because if you are, an African-American person, your jacket does not define you. It's just something. She said yes. Okay, so I was on the right page.
Yeah, so she could write a phenomenology of femaleness,
right.
A phenomenology of blackness. Yes, absolutely. Just like in the poem, I say it's not about shuffling forward like you're wearing disposable flip-flops. If you guys have had a pedicure, you know what that feels like. I don't know where I'm going. I'm shuffling forward. It's so hesitant. A lot of people think that's how blind people walk. And I will tell you, I had a really heartbreaking experience one time. I was walking down the hallway on campus, and on this particular campus, there was a rehabilitation center for people who had lost their vision. And I saw this man using a white cane, and that a lot of blind people use a white cane, and he was very newly blind. I could tell from the way he was walking. And what was really sad to me was he was going so slow because that blindness was so new that he was still afraid. And he was not confident enough to move forward yet. And his mobility coach was like, it's okay. There's no obstacles in this hallway. You're clear. You can walk confidently. Like, this is our testing area. We're not going to trip you. Nobody's going to trip you. And he was still so hesitant. And he was a young person. He didn't have trouble walking. It was that he was afraid. He had not learned how to manage his own disability yet. And he was afraid to move forward. And I thought, whoa, that's a man who has lived in a world where blindness is bad and you can't live with it. And so he didn't know how to live with it yet.
Yeah. So Reagan said she has a blind friend that clings on her arm.
Yeah.
And why do they cling?
Okay, cling on your arm. So that's called a sighted guide, Reagan, when you hold out your elbow and the blind person holds on. If your blind friend does not use a cane, it's what they do because they don't know what's in front of them. I used a sighted guide for many years, and then I used a white cane, and now I use a guide dog. A lot of times people do it because they don't want to use a white cane. They're afraid of using one because other people will then know that you're blind. But here's a big hint. If you walk around, you can't see where you're going. You either look drunk or blind, and I'd rather be blind than drunk. A lot of times people just need help. Like they're not ready to use a cane yet, or they don't have any training with a cane. So they hold on to somebody's arm, or maybe it's really crowded. So if they use their cane, it would bang into people, and people don't take kindly to being hit by a blind person. It was me for many years tapping people with a cane because they wouldn't move. So that's probably why. It's just to help that person get around. And maybe at some point they'll use a cane or a dog, or their vision may not be bad enough for either one of those things. And so they may feel like this is good enough for now. I think this is a good place to wrap up. If you asked a question, please post your email in the chat box so that you can be entered to win an audiobook.